The first time Sergeant Klaus Reinhardt saw what the Russians had done to their rifles, he was standing over the body of a Soviet soldier in a burned-out farmhouse outside Rzhev. February 1943. The weapon lying next to the dead man looked wrong. The bolt had been filed down, the trigger group had been modified, and there were markings on the receiver he'd never seen before. Klaus picked it up, and that's when he realized the Soviet soldier had died reloading. The magazine was still half full, but the rate of fire from this position had been impossible. Absolutely impossible. 3 of Klaus's men were dead in the doorway, all shot in less than 4 seconds. From a standard issue Mosin-Nagant that should have required at least 12 seconds to fire those rounds. Something was very wrong. The Eastern Front in early 1943 was a meat grinder that consumed men faster than either side could replace them. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht was reeling but not broken. The Soviets were advancing but bleeding with every mile, and somewhere in that frozen hell, Soviet armorers and frontline soldiers had begun doing something that would change the tactical reality of close-quarters combat. They were modifying their rifles in ways that violated every regulation in the Red Army manual, and they were doing it in secret, because the modifications were dangerous, unauthorized, and in some cases reduced the service life of the weapon to a fraction of its original specification. But in the villages and forests between Moscow and Berlin, service life didn't matter. Only the next 30 seconds mattered. Klaus Reinhardt had been fighting in Russia for 18 months. He'd seen winter turn German steel brittle. He'd watched men freeze to death in their sleep. He'd learned to respect the Soviet soldier in a way he never respected the enemy in France or Poland. The Russian would fight when surrounded, would hold ground that couldn't be held, would attack when attacking made no sense. But this was different. This wasn't courage or fanaticism. This was technical, calculated, and it was spreading. The Mosin-Nagant rifle was a weapon designed in 1891. It was robust, accurate at range, and utterly reliable in conditions that would jam a German Mauser. But it was also slow. The bolt action required a full cycle between shots. A trained rifleman could fire perhaps 10 to 12 aimed rounds per minute. In close combat, that made the Mosin-Nagant a liability against German submachine guns and semi-automatic rifles. Soviet soldiers knew this. They died because of it, and so they began to experiment. The modifications started small and spread through the Red Army like whispered prayers. First, soldiers began filing down the bolt lugs to reduce the throw distance. This cut precious fractions of a second from each cycle. Then they started smoothing the bolt channels with whatever abrasives they could find. Sand, emery cloth, even crushed glass mixed with oil. The internal surfaces of the receiver were polished until the bolt moved like water. Trigger groups were adjusted to reduce pull weight. Some soldiers removed the safety entirely because in combat, safeties cost lives. But the most dangerous modification was what Soviet soldiers called the partisan cut. They would carefully, very carefully, reduce the pressure required to unlock the bolt by filing down the camming surfaces. Done correctly, this allowed a soldier to cycle the action with almost no resistance. Done incorrectly, it could cause the bolt to unlock while the chamber was still under pressure. The result was catastrophic. The bolt would blow backward into the shooter's face with enough force to kill instantly. Soviet political officers forbade the modification. Armorers refused to perform it, but soldiers kept doing it anyway, in dugouts and bunkers by candlelight and lantern glow. Because in a firefight, the difference between 3 seconds and 5 seconds was the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the snow. Klaus reported what he'd found to his commanding officer. Captain Ernst Vogel examined the modified rifle and made a decision that probably saved his company's life. He ordered every man to treat Soviet positions as if they were facing automatic weapons. Fire superiority tactics were adjusted. Assault distances were increased. The casual confidence that had marked German infantry operations in 1941 was gone. Now they moved carefully, because the Russian with the old rifle might not be slow anymore. In March 1943, Klaus's unit assaulted a Soviet position near Vyazma. Intelligence said they were facing a depleted rifle company with maybe 60 men. The Germans had numerical superiority and better weapons. The attack should have been straightforward. It wasn't. The volume of fire from the Soviet trenches was stunning. Not the sustained bursts of machine guns, but the rapid, rhythmic crack of bolt-action rifles firing far faster than bolt-action rifles should fire. Klaus's company took 37 casualties in the first 2 minutes. They pulled back, regrouped, called in artillery. When they finally took the position 3 hours later, they found 41 dead Soviet soldiers and enough modified rifles to equip 2 companies. The modifications weren't uniform. Each soldier had adapted his weapon based on personal preference, available tools, and sheer desperation. Some rifles had been carefully refined by skilled hands. Others showed crude, dangerous alterations that could fail at any moment. But they all had one thing in common. They fired faster. And in the killing spaces of the Eastern Front, faster meant survival. The Wehrmacht intelligence reports from this period contain dozens of references to unexpectedly high rates of fire from Soviet positions. German after-action reports noted that Soviet riflemen were achieving engagement speeds that approach semi-automatic weapons. Casualty rates in close assault operations increased. Tactical doctrines were revised. And through it all, German commanders struggled to understand how the Soviets had suddenly improved their small arms capability without introducing new weapons. The answer was simple and terrifying. They hadn't introduced new weapons. They'd made the old ones faster by accepting risks that no military establishment would officially sanction. Soviet soldiers were dying from catastrophic bolt failures. There are no precise statistics, but field reports and survivor accounts suggest that perhaps 1 in every 40 modified rifles would eventually fail during operation. The bolt would blow back, the shooter would die, and another soldier would pick up the rifle, inspect it, maybe file down the damaged parts, and keep using it. Because even with the risk of catastrophic failure, the modified rifle was still more likely to keep you alive than the unmodified one. By summer 1943, the modifications had become so widespread that Soviet armorers began to tacitly acknowledge what was happening. They couldn't officially approve the modifications, but they could teach soldiers how to do them safely, how to test a bolt after modification, how to recognize when a rifle was becoming dangerous, how to distribute the risk across multiple weapons so that no single soldier was entirely dependent on a modified rifle that might fail. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Klaus Reinhardt survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1945 with wounds that never fully healed and memories that never faded. In the 1960s, he wrote a memoir that was published in a small regional press. Most of it dealt with the standard narratives of the Eastern Front, the cold, the distances, the endless combat, but he devoted an entire chapter to the modified rifles. He wrote, "We feared their tanks and their artillery. We respected their courage and their endurance, but nothing unsettled us quite like the sound of their rifles firing faster than rifles should fire. It meant they were willing to risk everything, even the weapons they depended on, to kill us." That kind of desperation doesn't surrender, it just keeps coming. The tactical impact of the rifle modifications was significant, but difficult to quantify. Soviet after-action reports rarely mentioned the modifications directly because they were technically unauthorized. German reports noted increased casualty rates, but attributed them to various factors: improved Soviet training, better tactics, higher morale after Stalingrad. But soldiers on both sides knew the truth. The sound of combat had changed. The rhythm of bolt-action rifles in skilled hands now approached the cadence of semi-automatic weapons. There were failures beyond the catastrophic bolt blowbacks. Modified rifles wore out faster. Headspace, the critical distance between the bolt face and the chamber, would gradually increase as the file surfaces wore unevenly. This reduced accuracy and eventually made the rifle unsafe to fire. A standard Mosin-Nagant could last for decades with proper maintenance. A heavily modified one might be unusable after a few thousand rounds. But Soviet soldiers operated in an environment where a few thousand rounds represented months of survival. If you lived long enough to wear out your modified rifle, you'd already beaten the odds. Not every Soviet soldier modified his rifle. Snipers kept their weapons stock because accuracy at distance mattered more than rate of fire. Machine gunners had no reason to modify, but the average rifleman, the soldier who fought at ranges under 200 meters, in villages and forests and shattered cities, he was the one who filed and polished and adjusted. He was the one who took the risk because the alternative was facing German firepower with a weapon that was too slow. The German response evolved throughout 1943 and 1944. Units operating on the Eastern Front began to carry more automatic weapons. The assault rifle concept, which would eventually produce the STG-44, was partly driven by the need to match the increased close-range firepower of Soviet infantry. German soldiers were taught to engage Soviet positions with overwhelming fire before closing. The old tactic of suppression followed by rapid assault became more cautious, because the Russians with their old rifles weren't as slow anymore. By 1944, Soviet industry was producing newer weapons in larger quantities. The semi-automatic SVT-40 became more common. Submachine guns flooded the front lines. The need for rifle modifications decreased as better weapons became available. But in some units, especially partisan formations and rear area troops who received equipment last, the modified Mosin-Nagants remained in service until the end of the war. There's a photograph in the Russian State Military Archive. It shows a group of Soviet soldiers in Berlin, May 1945. They're standing in front of the Reichstag. 6 men, rifles held casually, faces exhausted but alive. 4 of the rifles in that photograph show signs of modification: polished bolts, altered trigger guards, the telltale scratches of amateur gunsmithing. These men had carried those weapons from God knows where to the heart of the Third Reich. The rifles had held together, the soldiers had survived, and the war was over. Klaus Reinhardt never forgot the farmhouse outside Rief. He never forgot the modified rifle or the Soviet soldier who died reloading. In his memoir, he wrote, "I kept that rifle for 3 days before an officer confiscated it for intelligence analysis. During those 3 days, I would work the bolt over and over, feeling how smoothly it moved, how quickly it cycled. It was beautiful in a terrible way. Someone had taken a reliable but slow weapon and made it dangerous in both directions. Dangerous to the enemy and dangerous to the user. And they'd done it because dying from a bolt failure was better than dying because your rifle was too slow." I think about that sometimes, about what kind of war makes that calculation make sense. The modified Mosin-Nagants represented something larger than their tactical impact. They represented the Soviet Union's entire approach to the war: accept casualties that would be unthinkable to any other nation, make do with what's available, innovate at the lowest level when the system can't provide solutions, and keep fighting regardless of cost. The German Wehrmacht was a more technically sophisticated military force, better trained, better equipped, better led at the tactical and operational level. But sophistication has limits when facing an enemy willing to modify their rifles in ways that might kill them, just for the chance to fire a few seconds faster. The precise number of modified rifles will never be known. Soviet records are incomplete, and soldiers certainly didn't report unauthorized weapon modifications through official channels. But based on German intelligence assessments, post-war interviews, and physical evidence, military historians estimate that between 1942 and 1944, somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Mosin-Nagant rifles were modified by frontline soldiers. That's not an official program. That's not an armory initiative. That's individual soldiers in frozen dugouts and shell-torn villages, taking files and oil and desperate ingenuity to their rifles because the system couldn't give them what they needed to survive. Some modifications were sophisticated. There are examples in museums today of Mosin-Nagants that were clearly worked on by skilled gunsmiths. Professional quality polishing, precisely calculated adjustments, even hand-fitted parts to replace worn components. These were likely done by armorers who understood what soldiers needed and were willing to look the other way from regulations. Other modifications were crude and dangerous. Bolts filed unevenly, trigger mechanisms that would fail under stress, rifles that were accidents waiting to happen. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The modifications created a dilemma for Soviet leadership. On one hand, they couldn't officially approve soldiers damaging military equipment in ways that reduce service life and increase the risk of catastrophic failure. On the other hand, they couldn't deny that the modifications were having a positive tactical impact. The solution was unofficial tolerance. Political officers were quietly instructed not to punish soldiers for rifle modifications unless the modifications were clearly dangerous or the soldier was negligent. Armorers were given discretion to inspect and adjust modified rifles, rather than forcing soldiers to restore them to original configuration. This produced an unusual situation, where the Red Army officially forbade rifle modifications, while simultaneously creating informal systems to make the modifications safer. Experienced armorers would circulate through frontline units, inspecting rifles, teaching soldiers what was safe and what wasn't, and in some cases, performing the modifications themselves with proper tools and knowledge. It was a very Soviet solution, ideologically impossible, but practically necessary. The German soldiers who faced the modified rifles had mixed reactions. Some, like Klaus Reinhardt, understood what they were facing and respected the desperate innovation it represented. Others saw it as confirmation of Soviet backwardness. A modern military force shouldn't need soldiers to modify their own weapons, but respect or contempt didn't change the tactical reality. When German infantry assaulted Soviet positions, They faced higher volumes of rifle fire than they'd faced in 1941 or 1942, and men died because of it. There's a Soviet veteran named Dmitry Volkov who was interviewed in 1988 for an oral history project. He'd served as a rifleman from 1942 to 1945, fighting from Stalingrad to Prague. When asked about weapon modifications, he said, "Everyone did it. You get your rifle, and the first thing you do is find someone who knew how to make it faster. I had a sergeant who'd been a gunsmith before the war. He modified my rifle in January 1943. Took him 3 hours. He filed the bolt, smoothed everything, adjusted the trigger, then he tested it, made me fire 20 rounds while he watched." He said if the rifle was going to fail, it would probably fail in the first 50 rounds after modification. Mine didn't fail. I fired that rifle for 2 years, thousands of rounds. It never jammed, never failed, and it was fast. So fast. I could fire 4 aimed shots in the time it used to take me to fire 2. That made all the difference. Dmitry Volkov survived the war. His rifle is in a private collection somewhere in Russia. The bolt shows clear signs of modification. Polished surfaces, reduced camming angles. It's been test-fired in modern times. It cycles noticeably faster than an unmodified Mosin-Nagant, and it's still safe to shoot, which means whoever modified it 75 years ago knew exactly what they were doing. The story of the modified rifles is ultimately a story about adaptation under pressure. The Soviet Union entered World War II with inadequate small arms for the kind of war they were forced to fight. The Mosin-Nagant was excellent for the battles of 1914, but in 1943, against an enemy with submachine guns and semi-automatic rifles, it was dangerously obsolete at close range. Soviet industry was producing newer weapons, but not fast enough, so soldiers adapted. They took the weapons they had and made them faster, accepting risks that peacetime militaries would never accept, because peace was gone and all that remained was survival. The Wehrmacht learned to fear many things on the Eastern Front. They feared the T-34 tank. They feared the Katyusha rocket launcher. They feared the Soviet winter and the endless Soviet manpower. But they also learned to fear the sound of Mosin-Nagant rifles firing faster than Mosin-Nagant rifles should fire, because that sound meant they were facing soldiers who'd modified their weapons in secret, soldiers who'd accepted the risk of catastrophic failure, soldiers who'd bet their lives that their rifles wouldn't blow up in their faces, all for a few extra seconds of firepower. And that kind of enemy doesn't break easily. Klaus Reinhardt died in 1982. His memoir is out of print now, hard to find except in specialized military libraries. But the chapter about the modified rifles is still read by military historians studying small unit tactics on the Eastern Front, because it captures something that's easy to miss in the grand narratives of tank battles and strategic operations. War at the individual level is about small advantages. A rifle that fires a second faster, a position that offers a foot more cover, a decision made in a split second that means you go home and someone else doesn't. The modified Mosin-Nagants gave Soviet soldiers a small advantage. Not enough to change the course of major operations, not enough to appear in the official histories, but enough to matter in the farmhouses and forests and frozen villages where individual soldiers fought and died. Enough that decades later, German veterans still remembered the sound, still remembered the shock of facing higher volumes of fire than they'd expected, still remembered the moment they realized the Russians had found a way to make their old rifles faster. In the end, the war was decided by factories and oil fields and strategic decisions made by men far from the front lines. But battles are fought by individual soldiers with individual weapons. And sometimes, in the gaps between what high command provides and what the situation demands, soldiers innovate. They file and polish and adjust. They take risks that shouldn't be taken. They modify their rifles in secret and hope the modifications hold together long enough to matter. And sometimes, for some of them, it works. The modified Mosin-Nagants are mostly gone now. Some are in museums, identified by the telltale signs of soldier-made modifications. Others are in private collections, still functional after 80 years. Most were probably destroyed, worn out, or lost in the chaos of war and its aftermath. But their impact lingers in the historical record, in German after-action reports that noted unexpectedly high rates of fire, in Soviet veteran accounts that mention faster rifles, in casualty statistics that showed German assault operations becoming more costly as the war progressed. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. There's a broader lesson here about military effectiveness. The Wehrmacht in 1941 was probably the most tactically proficient military force in the world. Better training, better coordination, better equipment at almost every level. But the Red Army had something else. the ability to adapt at the lowest level, to innovate when innovation wasn't authorized, to take enormous risks when risks were the only option left. The modified rifles weren't a sign of Soviet superiority. They were a sign of Soviet desperation. But desperation, when channeled into practical action, can be surprisingly effective. The Soviet soldier who modified his rifle wasn't trying to make a statement about military doctrine or industrial capacity. He was trying to stay alive. He'd seen what happened in close combat when German submachine guns went up against unmodified Mosin-Nagants. He'd watched friends die because they couldn't fire fast enough. So he took a file or a stone or whatever he could find, and he made his rifle faster. Maybe it would fail. Maybe the bolt would blow back and kill him. But maybe it wouldn't. And in that gap between certainty and possibility, between regulation and survival, he made his choice. The German soldiers who faced the modified rifles made their own choices. Some adapted their tactics. Some called for more automatic weapons. Some just accepted that the Eastern Front was a place where the rules kept changing, where the enemy kept finding new ways to kill you, where yesterday's advantages disappeared overnight. Klaus Reinhardt adapted. He treated every Soviet position as more dangerous than it looked. He moved more carefully. He survived. Many of his comrades didn't. By late 1944, the Red Army was a different force than the one that had nearly collapsed in 1941. Better equipped, better trained, better supplied. The need for rifle modifications had largely passed. New weapons were available. But the soldiers who'd fought with modified rifles through 1942 and 1943 and into 1944, they'd learned something that stayed with them. They'd learned that survival often depends on the willingness to take risks that shouldn't be taken, to modify weapons that shouldn't be modified, to keep fighting when fighting seems impossible. The war ended in May 1945. The Soviet Union had lost somewhere between 20 and 27 million people. The precise number will never be known. Entire villages were erased. Entire generations were decimated. And among those millions were soldiers who'd modified their rifles in secret, who'd bet their lives on filed bolts and polished chambers, who died when their rifles worked and died when their rifles failed. Because on the Eastern Front, death was the default and survival was the exception. The modified Mosin-Nagants terrified the Wehrmacht, not because they were superior weapons, they weren't, but because they represented something the Germans couldn't match. They represented an entire nation's willingness to accept casualties, take risks, and keep fighting regardless of cost. You can't defeat that with tactics. You can't defeat that with training. You can only match it or break under it. The Wehrmacht tried to match it and eventually broke. There's a museum in Volgograd, formerly Stalingrad. In one of the display cases, there's a Mosin-Nagant rifle with clear signs of modification. The placard is simple. Modified by frontline soldier 1943. Donor unknown. No name, no unit, no story, just a rifle that someone made faster because faster meant survival. And next to it, a quote from a Soviet veteran. "We were not supposed to modify our rifles, but we did it anyway because the rules were written by people who weren't being shot at." That quote captures something essential about combat. The distance between theory and practice. Between what's supposed to happen and what actually happens when bullets start flying. The modified rifles existed in that gap. Unauthorized, but necessary. Dangerous, but effective. Forbidden, but widespread. They were a perfect example of the difference between fighting a war on paper and fighting a war in frozen forests where the enemy is 100 meters away and closing fast. Klaus Reinhardt's last diary entry, written days before he died in 1982, mentioned the farmhouse outside Rzhev one final time. He wrote, "I'm an old man now. The war was a lifetime ago, but I still think about that Soviet soldier and his modified rifle. I think about the hours he must have spent filing down that bolt, testing it, hoping it would hold together. I think about the risk he took every time he pulled the trigger. And I think about how he died anyway, reloaded halfway through a magazine surrounded by German soldiers who'd learned to fear the sound of his rifle. War makes you do impossible things. And sometimes, the impossible things work, and sometimes they don't. But you do them anyway because the alternative is giving up. And giving up means dying, so you file your bolt and polish your chamber and you hope. That's all you can do. Hope that your modifications hold. Hope that you're faster than the other man. Hope that you see tomorrow. That Soviet soldier didn't, but his rifle worked perfectly until the moment he died. And that's the most anyone could ask for. The modified Mosin-Nagants were never officially acknowledged by the Soviet military establishment. They don't appear in official equipment tables. They're not mentioned in doctrinal manuals. But they're there in the historical record if you know where to look. In German intelligence reports. In veteran memoirs. In after-action summaries that note unexpectedly high volumes of fire, in museum collections that contain rifles with polished bolts and modified trigger groups, in the memories of men who faced them and men who carried them. History is made by decisions at the highest levels, but history is lived by individuals at the lowest levels, and sometimes those individuals make decisions that change their small corner of the war. A Soviet soldier files down his bolt. A German sergeant adjusts his tactics. Both men are trying to survive. Both men are trying to make it through the next day, the next week, the next battle. And in that struggle, in that desperate improvisation, something changes. Not enough to alter grand strategy, but enough to matter to the men involved. Enough to save some lives and cost others. Enough to terrify the enemy, even if just a little. The modified rifles are gone now, mostly. The soldiers who carried them are gone, too. The war they fought ended 80 years ago. But the story remains. The story of soldiers who took their regulation rifles and made them faster, who accepted risks that regulations forbade, who bet their lives on modifications that might fail catastrophically, all because the alternative was facing the enemy with weapons that were too slow. They were never supposed to do it. They did it anyway. And for some of them, for a little while, it worked. And that made all the difference. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. These stories of courage, innovation, and sacrifice must be preserved for future generations, who must understand the true cost of freedom and the lengths to which ordinary men went to defend their homes and their lives. Pod continuar com o rotero. 00849, the practice of modifying rifles spread through the Red Army in ways that military historians are still trying to fully document. It wasn't centralized. There was no official directive. Instead, it moved like information has always moved between soldiers, whispered in trenches, demonstrated in quiet moments between battles, passed from veteran to replacement like a secret that might save your life. Private Anatoly Sokolov received his Mosin-Nagant in October 1942 at a depot outside Moscow. He was 19 years old. The rifle was older than he was, manufactured in 1898, and it had seen service in 3 wars before Anatoly ever touched it. The armorer who issued it told him to keep it clean and keep it oiled. That was the extent of his instruction. 3 weeks later, Anatoly was in a communications trench outside Rzhev, and a corporal named Grigory was showing him how to file down the bolt lugs. Grigory had been fighting since 1941. He'd survived encirclements, winter offensives, and more close combat than most soldiers experience in an entire war. His rifle had been modified so extensively that it barely resembled standard issue anymore. The wood stock had been cut down for easier handling in confined spaces. The bolt had been polished until it gleamed. The trigger pull was so light that Anatoly was afraid to touch it. Grigory fired 6 rounds in the time it took Anatoly to fire 3, and all 6 hit a target at 75 meters. "The rifle wants to be fast," Grigory told him. "Factory makes it slow because slow is safe. Safe for long service life, safe for depot storage, safe for peacetime. But we're not in peacetime, so we make it fast. Fast keeps you breathing," Anatoly learned. He filed carefully, testing the bolt action after every few strokes. He used oil and sand to polish the internal surfaces. He adjusted his trigger until it broke clean at just under 2 kilograms of pressure. It took him 4 days to complete the modifications. On the 5th day, his unit attacked a German position in a destroyed factory complex. Anatoly fired 17 rounds in 90 seconds. He killed 3 German soldiers and survived an engagement that left half his squad dead. His rifle never jammed, never hesitated. The bolts cycled like water flowing downhill. 2 weeks later, Grigory died when his rifle exploded during a firefight. The bolt blew straight back into his face. Anatoly never learned exactly what failed, whether the locking lugs had been filed too aggressively, whether metal fatigue had finally caught up with the modifications, whether it was just terrible luck. But he saw the body afterward, saw what a rifle could do to a man when it failed catastrophically. And he kept using his own modified rifle anyway, because the alternative was being slower than the enemy, and slower meant dead just as certainly as a bolt failure meant dead. The mathematics of risk on the Eastern Front were brutal and straightforward. An unmodified Mosin-Nagant gave you perhaps a 2% disadvantage in close-range firefights compared to German small arms. That translated to roughly 2 additional deaths per 100 engagements, or 1 additional death per 50. A catastrophic bolt failure happened perhaps once in every 40 modified rifles over their service life. If you fought in 100 engagements with an unmodified rifle, you might face that 2% disadvantage in 30 of them. If you fought in 100 engagements with a modified rifle, you face perhaps a 2.5% chance of catastrophic failure. The math said modify, and soldiers, even soldiers with limited education, understood the math intuitively. But mathematics couldn't account for psychology. Every time Anatoly pulled the trigger on his modified rifle, a small part of his mind waited for the bolt to blow back. Every time he worked the action, he wondered if this would be the cycle where metal fatigue finally won. He cleaned his rifle obsessively, inspected it constantly, watched for any sign of stress or wear, and he kept firing it because the alternative was unthinkable. By mid-1943, German intelligence had collected enough modified rifles to conduct systematic analysis. They were sent to Wehrmacht testing facilities where engineers and armorers examined them in detail. The reports from these examinations still exist in German military archives. They noted the reduced bolt throw, the polished surfaces, the modified trigger groups. They calculated that a skilled soldier with a modified Mosin-Nagant could achieve a rate of fire approximately 40% higher than with an unmodified rifle. They also noted the safety risks and predicted failure rates, and they concluded that the Soviets were accepting casualty rates from weapon failures that would be unacceptable in any Western military force. The German response was twofold. First, tactical doctrine was adjusted to account for higher volumes of Soviet rifle fire. Second, the Wehrmacht accelerated development of its own semi-automatic and automatic rifles. The MP-43, which would become the STG-44, was partly a response to the tactical situation on the Eastern Front, where Soviet infantry were proving more dangerous at close range than German pre-war doctrine had anticipated. The modified Mosin-Nagants weren't the only factor driving German weapons development, but they contributed to a growing realization that the Wehrmacht needed to match Soviet close-range firepower. Anatoly Sokolov survived the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. He survived the advance through Ukraine in late 1943 and early 1944. He survived the Bagration offensive in summer 1944. And through all of it, he carried his modified rifle. By early 1945, the rifle had fired more than 3,000 rounds. The bolt was worn but still functional. The barrel was burned out to the point where accuracy beyond 100 meters was questionable, but it still fired, still cycled fast, still kept him alive. In March 1945, Anatoly's unit received new weapons, SKS semi-automatic carbines fresh from Soviet factories. The modified Mosin-Nagants were supposed to be turned in for depot storage or scrapping. Anatoly kept his. He wrapped it in oilcloth and buried it in the basement of a destroyed building outside Kustrin. He'd carried that rifle for more than 2 years. It had saved his life more times than he could count, and he couldn't bring himself to turn it in to some rear echelon armorer who would probably just throw it away. After the war, Anatoly returned to his village in Tula Oblast. He married, worked in a factory, raised 3 children. In 1947, he returned to Germany as part of an occupation unit. He went back to Kustrin and tried to find the building where he'd buried his rifle. The entire area had been rebuilt. He never found it. Somewhere under the streets of modern Kustrin, there's a Mosin-Nagant rifle that was modified by a 19-year-old soldier in 1942 that fired thousands of rounds in combat, that never failed despite all the risks, and that now lies forgotten in the rubble of a war that ended 80 years ago. The German soldiers who faced modified Soviet rifles developed their own adaptations. They learned to identify the sound, the slightly higher rate of fire, the distinctive rhythm of a bolt action cycling faster than it should. When they heard that sound, they adjusted. They used more grenades. They called for machine gun support sooner. They attacked with more caution. The modification of Soviet rifles led to the modification of German tactics, which led to changes in how both sides fought at the squad and platoon level. Lieutenant Hans Müller commanded a Wehrmacht infantry platoon from late 1942 through mid-1944. His unit rotated through various sectors of the Eastern Front, fighting in forests, villages, and open steppe. In a letter to his brother in April 1943, he wrote, "The Russians have done something to their rifles. I don't know what exactly, but they fire faster now. Our intelligence people say it's modifications, unauthorized, dangerous, but effective. I've started telling my men to assume every Soviet rifle position is semi-automatic until proven otherwise. Better to overestimate the enemy than to be surprised." Hans Müller was killed in June 1944 during Operation Bagration. His letters were returned to his family and later donated to a military archive. They provide a German perspective on the tactical impact of the rifle modifications, the uncertainty, the adjustment, the gradual realization that the enemy had adapted in ways that made him more dangerous. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The modifications weren't limited to bolt-action rifles. Some Soviet soldiers applied similar principles to other weapons. The PPSH-41 submachine gun was already a fast-firing weapon, but soldiers learned to polish the bolt channels and reduce friction points to improve reliability in extreme cold. The SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle, though less common, received modifications to improve its notoriously finicky gas system. Even the Degtyaryov light machine gun was sometimes modified, though this was rarer because machine guns were more carefully controlled by unit armorers. But the Mosin-Nagant remained the primary target for soldier modifications because it was the most common weapon, the slowest in its class, and the easiest to modify with basic tools. A soldier, with a file, some oil, and patience could transform his rifle in a few hours. The same modifications to more complex weapons would require specialized tools and knowledge that most soldiers didn't have. The Soviet officer corps had a complicated relationship with the rifle modifications. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains who fought alongside their men, generally tolerated or even encouraged the practice. They could see the tactical benefits. They understood that their soldiers were trying to survive, and many of them modified their own weapons. But senior officers and political commissars faced a dilemma. They couldn't officially approve modifications that violated regulations and increased risk. But they also couldn't deny that the modifications were helping Soviet soldiers kill more Germans. The solution was bureaucratic ambiguity. Modifications were officially forbidden, but enforcement was selective and inconsistent. A soldier caught modifying his rifle might be reprimanded or might be ignored, depending on his officer, his unit, and the tactical situation. Some units developed informal systems where experienced armorers would inspect modified rifles and either approve them or require corrections. Other units turned a blind eye entirely. A few units actually punished soldiers for modifications, but these were rare and generally in rear area formations where combat pressure was less immediate. Colonel Mikhail Petrov commanded a rifle regiment through most of 1943. In his post-war memoirs, published in limited circulation in the Soviet Union in 1965, he wrote, "The rifle modifications were an open secret. Everyone knew. Everyone participated or looked away. I knew that officially I should stop it, but I also knew that my regiment was more effective because of it. We had higher rates of fire. We won engagements we should have lost. So, I made a decision that probably violated a dozen regulations. I told my armorers to teach soldiers how to modify safely instead of trying to stop them from modifying at all. Better that they do it correctly than do it badly and die from bolt failures." Petrov's approach wasn't universal, but it was common enough to make a difference. Soviet soldiers learned to modify their rifles with at least minimal guidance and safety checking. This reduced, though didn't eliminate, the rate of catastrophic failures. It also created an informal body of knowledge about what modifications were safe and what modifications were suicidal. That knowledge spread through the Red Army like folklore, passed from veteran to replacement in the eternal cycle of war. The winter of 1943-1944 was particularly brutal. Temperatures dropped below -40 in some sectors. Metal became brittle. Lubricants froze solid. Weapons that functioned normally in moderate temperatures seized up or broke in the extreme cold. And paradoxically, this was when the modified rifles showed some of their greatest advantages. The reduced friction in the bolt action meant they were less likely to freeze. The polished surfaces shed ice more effectively. Soldiers found that their modified rifles kept functioning in temperatures that rendered unmodified rifles nearly useless. German soldiers noted this in their reports. Soviet weapons seemed to function better in extreme cold than German weapons. This wasn't because Soviet metallurgy was superior. It generally wasn't. It was because Soviet soldiers had adapted their weapons for the environment they were fighting in, while German soldiers were stuck with factory-standard weapons that hadn't been designed for -40-degree temperatures. Private First Class Werner Schmidt served in an infantry regiment that fought near Leningrad through the winter of 1943-1944. In a letter home in January 1944, he wrote, "The cold here is indescribable. Our rifles freeze. Our machine guns jam. Meanwhile, the Russians keep firing. Their weapons work when ours don't. How is this possible? They have less industry, worse equipment, but somehow their rifles function in temperatures that render ours useless. I think they must be doing something to them that we aren't told about." Werner was right. the Russians were doing something. They were polishing bolt channels until friction was minimized. They were using different lubricants, sometimes no lubricant at all, just dry metal sliding on dry metal. They were modifying trigger mechanisms to function with thick gloves. And they were accepting that these modifications might cause problems in warmer weather, because warm weather was months away and survival was measured in hours. The tactical impact of weapon reliability in extreme cold was significant. German units that should have had firepower superiority found themselves outgunned because their weapons wouldn't function. Soviet attacks that should have been repelled succeeded because German defensive fire was sporadic and unreliable. This wasn't decisive in any single battle, but across hundreds of small engagements through the winter of 1943-1944, it contributed to the steady grinding pressure that pushed German forces westward. By spring 1944, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The Red Army was larger, better equipped, and more experienced than in previous years. Soviet industry was producing weapons in massive quantities. The need for frontline rifle modifications was decreasing because better weapons were becoming available. But the modifications continued, partly from habit, partly because soldiers trusted what they knew worked, and partly because, even with better weapons available, a faster rifle was still an advantage. Sergeant Boris Volkov modified his first rifle in December 1942. By May 1944, he'd modified 6 different rifles, his own and 5 belonging to men in his squad who didn't trust themselves to do the work. He'd developed a refined technique. He could assess a rifle in minutes, determining exactly what modifications would provide maximum benefit with minimum risk. He knew by touch when a bolt channel needed more polishing. He could tell by sound when a trigger mechanism was properly adjusted. He'd become, in essence, an expert gunsmith, entirely self-taught, working with basic tools in field conditions. In June 1944, Boris was wounded during the opening phases of Operation Bagration. Shrapnel from an artillery shell left him with injuries that ended his frontline service. He was evacuated to a hospital in Minsk, then transferred to a recovery facility in the rear. He survived the war working in a supply depot, never returning to combat. But before he left his unit, he spent 2 days teaching 3 younger soldiers everything he knew about rifle modifications. The knowledge continued without him. This pattern repeated across the Red Army. Veterans taught replacements. Experienced soldiers passed their knowledge to new arrivals. The modifications became embedded in the informal culture of frontline units, a tradition maintained not through official channels, but through the practical wisdom of men trying to keep each other alive. The last major engagement where modified Mosin-Nagants played a significant tactical role was probably during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. By this point, the Red Army was well equipped with semi-automatic rifles, submachine guns, and other modern weapons. But in some units, particularly those that had been in continuous combat for years, soldiers still carried modified Mosin-Nagants, because those were the weapons they knew and trusted. Corporal Ivan Petrov was one of these soldiers. He'd received his Mosin-Nagant in January 1943 and modified it 3 weeks later. He'd carried it through 2 years of continuous combat. The rifle had been repaired multiple times, refinished twice, and had parts replaced after various incidents. But the core modifications remained. The bolt was polished, the trigger was light, the action was fast, and when Ivan crossed into Germany in January 1945, he was still carrying that rifle. His unit was offered new SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles during a brief rest period in Poland. Ivan declined. He knew his Mosin-Nagant. He knew exactly how it would behave under any conditions. He knew its quirks and its limitations. A new rifle, even a better rifle, would require relearning, and in combat, familiarity was worth more than technical superiority. So he kept his modified Mosin-Nagant and carried it into Germany. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Ivan Petrov survived the war. He was in Berlin when Germany surrendered. He returned to the Soviet Union in late 1945, was demobilized, and returned to his village in Bryansk Oblast. He kept his rifle, despite regulations requiring all weapons to be turned in. He hid it in his barn, wrapped in oilcloth, covered in grease. In 1952, during a routine militia inspection, it was discovered. Ivan was questioned, but not punished. By that point, tens of thousands of Soviet veterans had kept their weapons as souvenirs, and the authorities had largely given up trying to confiscate them all. Ivan's rifle is still in his family's possession today, kept by his grandson in a private collection. It's been examined by military historians and firearms experts. The modifications are clearly visible. The polished bolt, the lightened trigger, the worn but still functional mechanism. It's been test-fired under controlled conditions. It still works. The rate of fire is noticeably higher than an unmodified Mosin-Nagant. And it's still safe to shoot, which means the modifications were done correctly nearly 80 years ago by a soldier working with basic tools in field conditions. The story of the modified rifles ended not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual fade. As better weapons became available, fewer soldiers bothered to modify their Mosin-Nagants. As the war moved into Germany and Poland, Soviet logistics improved and supply chains became more reliable. The desperate improvisation of 1942 and 1943 gave way to the more conventional warfare of 1945. But the knowledge remained, the skills remained, and the rifles remained, carried by soldiers who trusted them more than they trusted newer weapons. There's a photograph taken in Berlin in May 1945. It shows a group of Soviet soldiers posing in front of the Brandenburg Gate. They're young, exhausted, victorious. 8 men, 8 rifles. 6 of the rifles are clearly modified. You can see the polished bolts even in the grainy photograph. These men had carried those weapons from God knows where to the heart of Nazi Germany. The rifles had held together. The soldiers had survived. And the war was over. The German soldiers who'd learned to fear the sound of fast-cycling bolt-action rifles went home to a destroyed country. Some wrote memoirs, some gave interviews, and almost all of them, when asked about the Eastern Front, mentioned the unexpected volume of Soviet rifle fire. They didn't always understand the cause, but they remembered the effect. They remembered assaults that should have succeeded, but failed because Soviet defenders were firing faster than expected. They remembered the adjustment, the caution, the gradual realization that the enemy had adapted. Klaus Reinhardt's memoir, written decades after the war, captured this German perspective. He wrote about respect mixed with fear, respect for an enemy that could adapt under pressure, fear of what that adaptation represented, a nation willing to accept any cost, take any risk, endure any sacrifice to win. The modified rifles were a small part of that larger reality, but for the soldiers who faced them, they were very real and very immediate. The Soviet Union never officially acknowledged the rifle modifications. Post-war military histories don't mention them. Official statistics don't account for them. But they're there in the archives if you know where to look. In German intelligence reports that noted unexpectedly high rates of fire. In Soviet after-action reports that mentioned improved performance of rifle units without explaining how that improvement was achieved. In pension applications where veterans mentioned weapons that had been modified. In thousands of small documentary traces that together tell a story the official histories missed. Military historians have spent decades trying to assess the overall impact of the rifle modifications. It's nearly impossible to quantify. How many German soldiers died because Soviet rifles were firing 40% faster? How many Soviet soldiers survived because their rifles gave them a critical advantage in close combat? The numbers can't be calculated with any precision, but the impact was real. It showed up in casualty rates, in tactical assessments, in the memoirs of soldiers on both sides. One historian, writing in the 1990s after gaining access to Soviet archives, estimated that the rifle modifications might have contributed to perhaps 5,000 additional German casualties and prevented perhaps 3,000 Soviet casualties across the entire course of the war. These are rough estimates, based on limited data and numerous assumptions. But even if the numbers are only approximately correct, they represent 8,000 lives, 8,000 individual human beings whose fates were influenced by soldiers filing down bolt lugs and polishing receiver channels in frozen dugouts. 8,000 lives is a small number in a war that killed tens of millions. But for those 8,000 people and for their families and for everyone whose life was touched by theirs, it was everything. War operates at 2 levels simultaneously: the grand strategic level where armies maneuver and nations clash, and the individual level where a soldier's survival depends on whether his rifle cycles a second faster than the enemy's rifle. The modified Mosin-Nagants operated at that second level. They were a tactical adjustment, not a strategic weapon. But tactical adjustments accumulate. Enough individual soldiers surviving means units surviving. Enough units surviving means armies surviving. And armies surviving means nations surviving. The Soviet Union survived. The Third Reich didn't. There were thousands of reasons for this outcome: industrial capacity, strategic reserves, political will, military leadership, geography, weather, luck. The modified rifles were one tiny factor among many. But they were a factor. They kept some Soviet soldiers alive who would otherwise have died. They killed some German soldiers who might otherwise have survived. And in a war where the outcome was determined by accumulation of casualties, accumulation of losses, accumulation of small defeats and small victories, even tiny factors mattered. Anatoly Sokolov, the soldier who learned to modify his rifle from Corporal Grigory in 1942, survived the war and lived until 1998. He was interviewed multiple times by historians and journalists. In one interview conducted in 1995, he was asked whether he thought the rifle modifications made a real difference in the war. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I don't know about the war," he finally said. "The war was huge. Millions of men, thousands of kilometers, years of fighting. Did my rifle being faster change the war? Probably not. But did it change specific moments? Yes, absolutely. I remember a fight in a village in Belarus. Winter 1944. Germans were in a house, we were in the street. I fired 12 rounds in about 20 seconds. Killed 2 Germans, wounded another. If my rifle had been unmodified, I would have fired maybe 8 rounds in those 20 seconds. Maybe killed 1 German, maybe wounded 1, and maybe the 3rd German would have killed me. So for me, in that moment, the modification was the difference between living and dying. Did it change the war? No. Did it change my war? Yes. That answer captures something essential about the modified rifles and about war itself. Grand strategy matters, industrial production matters, political decisions matter, but ultimately, wars are fought by individual soldiers in individual moments, and the accumulated weight of those moments determines outcomes. A rifle that fires a second faster doesn't change grand strategy, but it might change who survives and who doesn't in a firefight in a destroyed village on a winter afternoon in 1944. And sometimes, survival is all that matters. The modified Mosin-Nagants are mostly forgotten now. They don't appear in popular histories of World War II. They're not mentioned in documentaries. They're not taught in military academies as examples of tactical innovation. But they were real. They existed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers used them. They had a measurable impact on combat effectiveness. And they represented something important about how wars are actually fought, as opposed to how they're planned or remembered. Wars are planned by generals and politicians. They're fought by soldiers who modify their rifles in secret because the system can't give them what they need to survive. The gap between plan and execution, between doctrine and reality, between what should happen and what actually happens, that gap is where wars are really decided. The modified Mosin-Nagants existed in that gap. They were unauthorized, irregular, dangerous, and effective. They were soldiers taking the tools they were given and making them better because better meant survival. The story ends quietly. The last Soviet soldier to carry a modified Mosin-Nagant into combat probably did so sometime in 1945, though there's no way to know exactly when or where. The last veteran who'd modified his own rifle probably died sometime in the early 2000s, as the generation that fought World War II passed away. The last of the modified rifles still in existence sit in museums and private collections, silent testimony to desperate innovation under desperate circumstances. But the story matters. It matters because it tells us something true about war. It tells us that official doctrine and unofficial reality are often different things. It tells us that soldiers will adapt to survive, regardless of what regulations say. It tells us that small advantages accumulate into larger effects. And it tells us that sometimes, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, survival depended on a soldier's willingness to file down a bolt lug and hope the rifle didn't blow up in his face. Klaus Reinhardt never forgot that farmhouse outside Rzhev. The Soviet soldier with the modified rifle, the impossible rate of fire, the 3 dead Germans in the doorway. In the final entry of his memoir, he returned to that moment one last time. "I think about that soldier sometimes," he wrote. "I never learned his name, never knew where he was from or what he did before the war, but I know he spent hours modifying his rifle. I know he took risks that could have killed him just as easily as my bullets did, and I know that in his final moments, his rifle was still working. Still firing faster than it should have been able to fire. He died fighting, and his weapon didn't fail him. In a war where so much failed, where so many things went wrong, that modified rifle did exactly what it was supposed to do. It gave him a chance. It wasn't enough. He died anyway. But it gave him a chance. And that's all any of us had on the Eastern Front. A chance. Sometimes the chance worked out. Most times it didn't. But we all kept trying because trying was the only option besides giving up. And giving up meant dying for certain instead of dying, probably, That Soviet soldier chose probably over, certainly. His modified rifle was that choice made real. And even though I killed him, even though he's been dead for 40 years, I respect that choice. I respect the hours he spent filing metal and testing bolts. I respect the risk he took, because I did the same thing in my own way. We all did, German and Russian. We all modified something, adapted something, took risks we shouldn't have taken, because the alternative was accepting death, and none of us were ready to do that. That's where the story ends, with respect for desperation, with understanding that sometimes the only difference between dying and surviving is the willingness to modify your rifle in secret and hope it holds together long enough to matter. The modified Mosin-Nagants terrified the Wehrmacht, not because they were perfect weapons, but because they were proof that the enemy wouldn't quit, wouldn't accept defeat, wouldn't stop adapting. And in the end, that determination, that absolute refusal to accept defeat, was more powerful than any weapon. The rifles are silent now. The soldiers who carried them are gone. The war they fought ended 80 years ago, but the story remains. The story of ordinary men who took ordinary weapons and made them extraordinary through skill and desperation and sheer force of will. The story of innovation born from necessity. The story of risks taken because the alternative was unthinkable. The story of rifles modified in secret that terrified an army and helped change the course of history, one fired round at a time.